interrupt. So again, this is the last lecture, basically wrapping up what we've learned. It's a sort of a continuation of the last lecture, and then a synthesis and conclusion. So I wanted to bring in Herbert Gintis. I've mentioned him before during the last week, and particularly his work with Stan Bowles, as you saw this evolution of cooperation, uh, things like social preferences, and the role of norms in determining behavior are very important in his research. So this is actually the end, the last chapter of his book, The Bounds of Reason. It was published in 2009. It's a very how did you say it? A cheeky book. So he's basically not trying to make friends. He's critiquing a lot of the foundations of social science today in various disciplines. So basically, he says that behavioral sciences include economics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, and political science, as well as biology, in as far as it relates to behavior of, say, animals and humans. So all these relate in the sense that they all study behavior. And he says actually they have four conflicting models: the psychological model of behavior, the sociological model of behavior, the biological model, and the economic model. And in fact, he says these are, as they are initially designed, incompatible. So there's a lot of contradictions in the research, say, that a psychologist comes up with in relation to, say, what sociologists or economists do. So you see this again in these debates between behavioral and neoclassicists who say, are people rational or are they irrational? Again, a lot of these debates, Gintis suggests, are colored or informed by the fact that, again, these different models have different assumptions, and the different assumptions actually lead to these weird and contradictory results where, somebody like a psychologist saying, well, people are all irrational, and the economist saying, well, actually, no, we're all rational. So actually, Gintis is looking for a common a synthesis or unification of these various models, and says that they can all be slightly modified to create a unified framework. And the necessary elements of this framework, again, we've studied a lot of these over the past week. This gene cultural coevolution, if you recall, the fact that we develop larger brains over the period of human evolution, hundreds of thousands, if not even millions of years, and that these larger brains allowed us to learn and also teach culture to the next generation. So this interaction between genes and culture in the, so to speak, the coevolution of the human species. The socio-psychological theory of norms. Again, we focused a lot on norms and morality and the impact that they have on, the ability to actually improve upon the behavior of individualized rational agents. So again, think about Robert Aumann's notion of coordinated equilibrium. Outside of this prisoner's dilemma, we can always coordinate, communicate, and say, actually, it would be better for both of us or all of us to actually behave in this way. So again, the importance of the socio-psychological theory of norms. Where do they come from? What do they mean? And how do they impact the outcomes of social behavior? Game theory, he says, should be part of this synthesized or unified theory of behavioral science. Again, we've talked a little bit about game theory, things like, again, these models of Aumann, the rational actor model, which he says is not incorrect, but has to be augmented with these other theories. It does not account for everything, and again, it's a question of how you define rationality. And then, of course, in the end, he adds complexity theory because, again, we live in societies where there are social structures that have different levels, and what pertains to one level isn't necessarily the case at a higher level or, again, at a lower level. So one theory or one size doesn't fit all, and you really have to adapt the theory to the particular level that you're at. If you're looking at an organization, or if you're looking at an entire economy or an entire nation, again, you need different approaches related to the level of complexity. And he says, in fact, this is not so difficult to achieve, this unification. he says actually it implies change only in areas of overlap. So if you have some weird project about, stock market, I don't know, the shifts in prices of stock markets, you may not in that particular model need to relate again to anthropology and biology and so on. You may just be able to stay inside your little unit. But again, because a lot of the questions in social science overlap into different disciplines, uh, there will be lots of areas of overlap, and it's exactly in those areas that he says there needs to be more interdisciplinarity and also transdisciplinary discussions. Okay, questions or too early in the morning? Moving on. So this is one of the most interesting books that I have read in recent years. It's a new book by David Ellerman. Again, I've mentioned his name a few times in the past week. And the book is called NeoAbolitionism. I think the subtitle is something like Ending Human Rentals. So again, David Ellerman is a really interesting writer. He's very well read. He's originally a mathematician, and he sort of got into economics on the basis of a very critical appraisal of what he was finding. So very similar to my own thinking. And I've spoken with Ellerman on various occasions. We occasionally write. He's also very friendly, and he doesn't appear to be friendly from his writings because he's actually very hostile to neoclassical economists, and he's always attacking them. But again, I find it a very interesting style, of course, because you do find a lot of sort of fake politeness in the academic world where people just say, let's agree to disagree, and you think this and I think that. But he's saying actually, this is actually wrong, and this is why it's wrong. So again, if you're interested in this kind of a forceful rhetoric and literature, then I certainly recommend his writing. He does not hold any bars, as they say. He doesn't hold back. So again, back to the book. He says, as we've been discussing, seeing membership in firms as a personal and not a property right is important, like citizenship. As we've been discussing, this is one of his more major ideas. So again, separating membership or strategic control from just the pure property right. In particular, he keeps returning to the idea of renting capital. So this idea, he says that capital is the owner of the company and always has the what is it the what's the word oh goodness, the returns. In any case, what I mean to say is the returns on whatever productive enterprise is being made. You know, this can be critiqued just on the basis that you can always rent capital. So if you rent a machine, if you rent your car, if you rent, some type of equipment to another person, you can't, of course, claim now this is what the word I was thinking of, the residual claimant. So basically, whatever profits are made by using that machine, in the case of renting the machine, go to the renter. So whoever's renting, whoever's paying for the use of the machine. So he says basically this idea that ownership determines residual claimancy is just a stupid idea, and it doesn't work in practice. So again, moving beyond this notion just of pure property rights, looking at rights of membership like citizenship should be the focus of firm behavior and firm organization. So in this sense, following this view, he basically argues that on the basis of three different main arguments, that traditional labor contracts are immoral. The wage contract, I am contracting with an employer to do certain job. He says that's similar to consensual forfeiture. That's a typo, actually, to despotic sovereigns. So where people say, well, I give up all my rights to the state or the monarch, to the king, uh, and also voluntary slavery or couverture marriage contracts. And these are contracts that no longer exist. So I'm sure the females here are glad that this is the case. So this is just to remind you of what that means. It's a contract actually where the wife is not legally able to own any property. So actually, basically, the wife legally in a couverture contract is an extension of her husband. So she can only own property in the name of her husband. She can only take out credit, in the name of her husband, and so on. So just as these types of contracts are immoral, voluntary slavery contracts. I give up my rights to a free will. Again, we have certain laws forbidding these types of contracts. You can't just give yourself up to the human trafficking. Similar to this, the labor contract, he says, is based on a legal fraud that people can actually give up their autonomy at the workplace. So again, looking back at this notion of inalienability, looking back at this notion of the differences between labor and capital, the fact that you cannot just sell, literally dissociate yourself from your labor. You actually have to be there to do it. This makes it very different and makes this modern labor contract very weird and again, he says, immoral. So just to sort of draw on his arguments, he says, again, from the perspective of contract theory, looking at, say, the slave. So the slave actually being a person, of course, the slave is a person. And he actually looks at the situation of the slave committing a crime. So in slave societies like the United States, before the Civil War, actually when slaves committed crimes, they were treated in the courts as persons. So again, you look at this first graphic where the top arrow goes to criminal slave, that's a slave that commits a crime, and you have this black square, so legal role of a person. In this sense, the slave is tried in court as a person. And on the other hand, you have the normal slave who's not committing any crimes. In this case, legally and via the courts, the slave is considered actually a thing, property. So in fact, elements of synthesis contradiction, and similar to if you've done any statistics, inferential statistics, for instance, these type 1 and type 2 errors. He says, in fact, this is an example of that type of error. So for instance, you see at the bottom here, something that is factually true and is accepted is a true positive, and something that is factually false and rejected, so that on the right and the bottom, is a true negative. On the other hand, if something is factually true and is rejected, you have a false negative. That's the type 1 error in statistics. And if something is factually false and it is accepted, so you don't reject this hypothesis, you have a type 2 error. Similarly, basically, he says this is the case for the labor contract and the slave situation. So moving on to this table 2.2, he says basically that somebody is factually person. Again, if you consider them as well legally person, that's the true positive. And if they're not factually person and you consider them not legally person, that's the true negative. However, if you are factually a person and considered legally a non-person, again, this is a type 1, as he says, injustice, not a type 1 error, because a de facto person is made legally a non-person. And on the other hand, if you are factually non-person and made legally person, it's a type 2 injustice. A de facto non-person is legally made a person. So again, it's a very legal theory based on contract law. His second main point is that actually one can do a lot by recovering what he calls a labor theory of property. Some of you might have heard of the labor theory of value, which of course is Karl Marx is associated with. And in fact, he contrasts, so Ellerman contrasts this labor theory of property with the labor theory of value, and actually saying that focus by people on the left or on the labor theory of property would be more convincing than the labor theory, than this argument that, and he says, labor should receive the total surplus. So this idea among Marxists and some on the left, he says basically that without labor, you would have nothing. Therefore, you should have all of the ownership in the hands of the workers. He says this is a discussion that actually hurts leftists because, again, you can attribute some rights or some returns to those investors of capital. But again, so again, he says this discussion of the surplus in itself is not is misleading because it only concerns a metaphor of this distribution of profits. So I put the pie there just for sake of shortness. That means profits among the various factors of production, as you might have heard in some course on microeconomics. And in fact, he says that the focus should be less on this distribution of surplus rather than on the pre-distribution, which is a word that he sort of comes up with. And what is pre-distribution? He means basically who is the firm. So actually, the pre-distribution determines the distribution of the various surpluses or whatever. because again, these are the people who then decide. Does that make sense? So again, I haven't really defined the labor theory of property here. He draws a lot on people like John Locke and others saying, if someone were to engage in meaningful labor, say I plot or I plow a field and I plant corn or something, then someone like Locke would say, this product, the corn, is mine by the fact that I have actually engaged in this meaningful labor. So it's not a question of whether the value of the corn exists because of my labor, but rather it's a question of whom the corn belongs to on the basis of who actually carried out the labor. So in a sense, he's saying that, again, the laborers, because they are working, it's not a question of creating the value, but it's a question of whom the product of the labor belongs to. Again, because they're using capital, there may be some rights to access a certain part by the capital, the owners of capital. But again, because the laborers are carrying out the work, they should have claims on, say, the property of that work. Any questions on that?
Yeah. So is the share of the worker changing? So if, for example, a new worker is coming to the field to work for whatever corn, this worker is getting a share as well. So like from the firm.
Yes.
Yeah, and how big is the share of the capital owner? So is there a limit or?
Well, that's not
It's
of
not the
concern
question.
to Element. He's basically saying this question about the metaphor. He says this is actually just a metaphor, and in fact, it's a question of who is actually in power to decide who receives what. So in the end, so what we have today is firms that are owned by capital investors who then contract with workers who are considered an external factor that provides a labor service. And what he's saying is, in fact, the workers are the firm, and the workers should have at least equal rights, if not the full rights, to actually stipulate uh, again what is done with production. In addition to what is produced and how it is produced and under what conditions and how long people work and these types of things. So again, this he argues with reference to this labor theory of property, that in fact, because the workers are engaging in this meaningful labor, they should have rights to determine that. And in fact, because we have this idea of renting labor today, this is his notion of renting humans, you could turn that around just as easily and have the workers as the owners who are investing with their labor and in fact are hiring or renting capital. So you can rent, a car, you can rent a machine. And the weird thing is, as Element says, today we have it, organized differently. So the capital owners are renting the laborers. And he says again, this is very strange, especially if you look at classical theories of property and classical theories of value, which actually have very different findings or different visions about what belongs to whom. Does that make sense? So again, it's this idea of alienating nature from, well, I shouldn't use the word alienating because we're using that a lot in a different context, but taking from nature and making something that was not there before. In this sense, meaningful labor uh, gives certain rights or bestows certain rights to the individual who is actually engaging in that labor. That's the sort of in a nutshell. Is that clear? So his third main point in the book, so again, we have firstly this notion of contract theory. Then he's arguing the second is property. And the third set of theories he tries to recover is this notion of a democratic liberal theory, which he contracts to I think, the classical liberal theory. Again, there are certain traditions. Do I have the graphic here? Yes, okay. There are certain traditions going back. Again, we were discussing the Peace of Westphalia and so on in Osnabrück in Münster. And going back a little bit further, even to the Reformation, someone like Martin Luther and the Enlightenment. So we've had notions of universal rights, going back at least as far, excuse me. And in fact, Element says that the shift throughout history has been one from alienation, or he uses the Greek term translatio, meaning actually carrying over the rights, say to the leader, like the Roman emperor, to delegation or concessio, which basically means that I am, well, you know the difference between, well, alienation means I'm actually abandoning the right, I'm carrying over the right in full to someone else. And the second is actually more of a, well, I guess you would say a principal agent relationship. Similar to today's, as we would see them, representatives. If we have a, we elect representatives in parliament, and they are not masters, to the slaves, that we are. They are rather our representatives to whom we delegate authority, but again, we maintain the sovereignty. So again, it's either there's delegation or there's sovereignty, rather than alienation. So again, the Element basically is arguing that after the Reformation, this notion of the inalienability, this doctrine of inalienability of conscience that Luther is coming up with, actually is true of all human decision making. The same argument that is true for keeping the church out of my own moral conscience is the case for even keeping my boss out of making decisions about uh, you know the dignity of my work or what have you. So in fact, he says, thus, any contract that legally alienates decision-making capacity to the ruler or the sovereign or, for instance, the employer cannot actually be fulfilled. So in fact, there are certain inalienable, again, going back to this term by Luther and Gregory Dow also uses the term of alienation. There are certain creative capacities that each individual has, that you have, that I have, that in fact cannot be transmitted in the sense of alienating. So translating it to someone else, just like the Roman emperor is caring for me and is has a certain, say, God-given right to actually decide for me what is best for me. No, actually, says Ellerman, there are certain creative capacities that cannot be carried over to someone else, except to delegate these things. So again, the employment contract is such a thing. And in fact, he's comparing these two traditions of liberal thought, again, distinguishing between the two notions of coercion and consent. And the first one is the standard, as he says here, the conventional classical liberal coercion versus consent framing. So on the one hand, we have coercion, where we have involuntary, illiberal institutions, political autocracy, the emperor, for instance, ruling on his own without any accountability. And we have, in the economic world, slavery and feudalism. And then again, in this conventional view, we have consent on the other side with voluntary liberal institutions like parliaments and so on. We have political democracy. And we have the employment system where people are free to sell their labor and so on. He emphasizes again that under this conventional view, political democracy and economic, employment systems are on the same side. Whereas in this tradition that he's trying to recover, this is the democratic liberal tradition. We have on the one side, again, coercion with these illiberal institutions, autocracy, slavery, feudalism. And then we have on the other side, on the side of consent, actually, firstly, voluntary liberal institutions. And those, again, he subdivides into this notion of alienation that I mentioned, and on the other hand, delegation. So again, the alienation side is voluntary alienation, a constitutional non-democracy. Say we have, again, things like private cities. If you go to Honduras or if you go to certain parts of China, there are these free trade zones where literally there are no rights for employees, rights for workers, and so on, and really low wages and so on. And again, there might be even private property. Um, the civic infrastructure might even be private property. So some company owns the sidewalks and decides, who gets to walk there and when. So again, this is the type of constitutional non-democracy that he means. Again, this is all on the side of alienation. And on this, in this graphic, again, the employment system of wage labor is on the side of alienation. And then he has this notion of delegation where you have, again, political or constitutional democracy, again, where we elect or select in some other way, maybe with sortition, our leaders, and workplace democracy. So in this rather um, sort of hidden tradition that he's trying to recover, and he has a really interesting discussion. I put this chapter actually on the list. Again, he's trying to recover this tradition, referring back to a lot of literature, going back again to the Reformation and the Enlightenment, saying actually that uh, this type of democracy that we actually aspire to, political democracy, is not compatible with the system of wage labor that we have today. In fact, we should apply similar notions of democracy in the workplace. Is that clear? So I just added this a few minutes before we met today. As I said, I'm reading this book right now. I'm not finished with it yet. That's why I didn't actually put it in the initial slides. But I'm enjoying it so much that I wanted to actually put it in there as well. And she makes very similar points to Ellerman. So anyway, Isabelle Ferreira is a sociologist at the University of Louvain in Belgium, and she's written some very interesting works on looking at firms again as political entities, very similar to the last discussion. And she basically says that over the history of capitalism, labor has moved from the private domain to the public domain. So again, firstly, we had workers who were producing silk gowns or shirts or pants, basically at home in the living room, selling them again in the market. And over time, we had this factory system, and companies became ever more sort of regulated, and we had labor law and so on. And in fact, she says, but a lot of this labor law actually still derives from this private domain. Uh, and actually, that should read pater familias, not damilias. So akin to the Latin pater familias or the Greek despots. So with a certain figurehead at the top and who decides what everyone else does. So she says actually there should be sort of a bicameral moment, and she means by this, refers to the English and French revolutions, where, for instance, in the English Revolution there was a concession by the king that there could be a House of Commons, where the commoners, the peasants, and the artisans could actually have their say in politics, and House of Lords, where the elite would have their say, and similar in France. And she says actually that companies should be governed by representatives of both labor investors as well as capital investors. So again, the government of a firm, she says, should be represented by both sides and not just by one, as it is today, where we have just capital investors who have the last say. Any questions? So this sort of concludes the input of the course, and the rest really are mostly just questions of reflection. I think there's only one slide left after this. So I wanted to finish by returning to the Methodenstreit, which was a debate, I suppose, in German-speaking countries, so Germany and Austria, probably as well Switzerland, in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th century. People like, there actually were two of these. We had one with Gustav Schmoller and Karl Menger, and I think Karl Menger and then Max Weber. So again, the questions that were asked at the time, I think, are very relevant again today. So what role does inference play in discovery, so scientific discovery? What role does deduction play? So, inferring from general experience in particular rules or tendencies, I guess, and versus, verifying the veracity of a certain theory. So we have a certain theory that we have in our minds, and we're trying to discover whether or not that comports or relates to reality. So what is the role of politics in science? That is the question of, normative science versus positive science, which again was something that was debated in the Methodenstreit. Also quantitative versus qualitative, or quantitative and qualitative. Are these two competing methods, or can they complement another in terms of finding more about the world in which we live? So those are just questions to generally refer to again, and we can come back to these questions if you all would like to discuss. And so these are sort of my final questions or remarks, to sort of emphasize what we have learned, if we have learned anything about these theories and ideas. So the first question is, what have the lessons of looking to the past with Polanyi, Thompson, Heilbronner, and the rest of these sort of moral economists and others taught us about the present and about future possibilities? What about the importance of morals? What have we learned about the importance of the type or content of rationality in terms of evaluating behavior as either rational or irrational? What have we learned about the idea of self-organized groups and institutions? About sympathy, mutual aid as drives in human evolution? How democracy and cooperation can be beneficial over the long run? Logical and also moral arguments for worker ownership and membership on company boards? Lessons for diversifying management and helping organizations focus on meeting members' needs? Have we helped point out some values and outlines of future social science? Again, these are questions. You might say no. And also just the final question I have is there a future for cooperation?